I think that'd be cool.
Okay, so we are being recorded.
Make sure we do it early in the evening, guys. Otherwise, it gets late.
So my view is that containers don't give you the basic information hiding or segregation responsibilities that you would have in functional programming or in any code. The idea of functionalizing something is you abstract away the complexity from someone else. Whereas if you just put a container on it, you can still poke around the details, and it doesn't really make it properly isolated or information hidden. So in my mind, break things down into macros, and then essentially you hide the complexity inside, whereas a container doesn't do that. And the other thing is, in my world, we openly ridicule anyone who has a workflow that you can't see on a normal Zoom level on 2 scroll screens. Because if you can't see it on 2 scroll screens, like 40 tools or less, then you don't really understand it. So, and you can't maintain it. So essentially, 40 tools or less, and if it's more than that, break it down into submodules, everyone in a macro. So the best canvas on earth in our team are things that have the main macro, the headline, the front page macro only has 3 tools on it, and then you break into the successive details. Funny enough, that looks a lot like well-written Java code or well-written Python code.
I think sometimes you need to split big workflows into small ones and build several workflows, one that runs before the other. And there are several use cases that can be nested or packed within a macro. I think, for example, there is something like the business continuity or the resumption of the use case that needs to have different workflows. So, for example, if you need to prepare, I don't know, X kind of or number of data sources to be processed, maybe you can build them into different macros. So if one crashes, you only need to rerun that small piece of workflow, or that workflow, sorry, small workflow, to rebuild your assets for that solution in general. And there are several situations where you need to build some functionality within a macro because of the confidentiality, because I don't know, security or whatever, or simplicity. But I don't think there is a one-fit-all solution for this question.
I kind of split between Mark and Sean. My fundamental principle, my first principle here is never write code twice. And so if I see a chunk of code that I'm like, you know what, this is a generic thing that I can add to my toolkit of generic things, and I can see me using this macro in another place, and it might be in another place in this specific context, right? But if I see a little bit, you know, I might start out writing a workflow and then get into an interesting little part of it, and then look at the code, and you're like, you know what? You're a handy little bit of code. I'm going to split you out into a macro and keep you in kind of a library, right? And so I'm always thinking of, from a library approach, how does this, would I add this to my library, right? Now, there's some contextual projects that should have macros in it, just to match the way that I think about programming, I guess. But more often than not, I would say the 80-20 rule for me is 80% of the time I will make macros because it solves a generic problem. And I think on down the road, I will probably reuse this macro. I have some really gigantic, thorny, ugly workspaces that would make Sean's skin tingle.
When you do build these macro assets of reusable code, how do you create impact assessments and make sure that all code using the macro is kept current version to that macro?
Any good technical hygiene around that? And in fact, if I have a macro, a generic macro that is kind of, I use everywhere all the time, every day, and then I realize I need to extend it or make some modification to it, then I have to just go do a text search of all my work product and see where that macro exists and then create a list of those things and then build out a test. You know, I'm going to make these changes because I need this one generic macro to work. You know, I need it to be extended, and I don't want to write a version 2 of it. I don't want to have 2 things. I want to have one thing that is now better, but I then incur a lot of technical debt to go back and test and see, all right, did this just break anything?
Yeah.
Yes, so I don't modularize just for reuse. I modularize for maintainability. So if I can find a way to get Alteryx to run, if you look at the canvases I'm submitting for Advent to Code, for the entire Advent to Code solution, there's 10 tools on a page, and then underneath that, the next layer has 10 tools on a page. So at each level, you should be able to read a canvas like a very simple story. And because that segregates responsibility, this thing's job is to do that. Everything outside that doesn't do that.
I like the way you think a lot, Sean, but I would add usually one more programming topic on top of it, because I like the function point. I totally agree. Everything is a function. You should separate it. But to me, a container is a private function of a workflow or a macro, and the macro is a public function. I have this validation workflow, 300 tools. On the whole workflow, you see less than 40 things. Let's just call it that way. There is the input, a couple of selects whatsoever, and then they have test containers. This test case 1, validate all mandatory fields are there. Test case 101, validate all mandatory fields have no null values. I don't want to have this in a macro because, as the others mentioned, if I would like to debug it, it's a damn pain. And it's not maintainability. I never will need this validation rule in any other workflow except of this one. So there's, for me, no point in separating it to a different workflow.
I only use 2 types of macros, really, batch and iterative. And I use iterative because if there's a piece of code that I know I need to rerun tens or hundreds of times, I want to wrap that in an iterative macro because it just doesn't make sense to do it that many times. Batch macros for me are really useful because I can change the behavior of tools in a certain way. And if I have a list of things that I want to run one at a time doing the same sequence again, a bit like iterative, but the input data doesn't change, that's what I use it. To make something a general tool, Mark, your data cleansing macro would be an example. You have to do so much testing and generalizing and documentation on that for it to be generally accepted that you can know, well, I can apply this in any workflow and it will just work. The macros that most of us write don't meet that criteria.
You have to consider the amount of data that is going to pass through that logic unit, because I'm thinking about the workflows that Mark builds, which are all the ones that I'm thinking about right now. They are not very complicated in terms of a huge amount of logic and functionality, but they process that amount, such amount of data, that having them all together within a workflow, no matter if it's a macro or a container or whatever, it's going to make them impossible to run as a solution, because it's going to take 12 hours or 24 hours to run a complete set of data. That's why I'm so enforcing the idea of that depends on the case. You cannot take one approach or the other directly, at least for me.
But if I want performance, I will not use my own macro. I will simply put in the proper formula and not go through a macro. But I'm in complete, utter agreement with Sean that if you can't explain the workflow to your mother or your 7-year-old child, you don't understand it well enough. And as we've seen before, simple is hard. I think that it is an art to the workflow to simplify it for everyone to be able to walk through it. And certainly by putting things, and I'll say obfuscating them in macros, you will work closer to achieving that goal with only 10 tools to explain. I'm worried more about getting the job done rather than explaining it to my 7-year-old grandchild.
It's interesting you say that, Mark, because as I'm hearing the context of what we're talking about, Sean and maybe a little bit Alex are talking about writing capital S software, right? And my version of the world is, yes, I write some capital S software, but a lot of times I need to answer something in the next hour and a half.
Right. Operating context, which is different as well, is we operate in a world where 20% of the staff leave every year, which means 20% of the canvases on my server are suddenly orphaned every year. Every year I'm dealing with a 20% orphan rate. So if people, and Tim, you're in exactly the same position. So if people don't write things in a way that is transferable and maintainable, even if it's simple, then essentially 15% of those are going to just be a waste next year, because if they're not maintainable, then next year you may as well just throw them away and start again.
Week somebody said, I have a 4,000 tool workflow that I inherited. Can you help me debug it? And I'm like, no. So, but yeah, it's like a lot of times when I'm creating the macros, it's because I'll go, oh, I did this in a previous project. I'm going to go and grab that. And at that point, I'm going to go, yeah, I'm just going to make this into a macro and do it. But I also agree with keeping the canvas clean. I mean, there's a lot to be said. If you do have hundreds and hundreds of tools, yeah, at that time, it's like, if it's not performance damaging, I will say, put this into a macro instead of a container, so that you're not looking at this workflow that goes on and on and on forever, or vertical down and down and down forever.
The other person that I build for in terms of maintainability is myself in the future, because myself in the future is kind of a dumbass. And often I'll build something today which seems genius, and then next week I can't understand it. If I can build something in a way that me in 3 weeks after my memory has gone all spongy can actually understand it, then that's the minimum standard.
Before I show that to anybody, I would document that workflow. I would put boxes around things. I don't use containers because they mess up my alignment, and I just don't like that, and I'm mainly like that. So, but I use comment tools. I would either comment on a tool by tool basis or comment blocks of things and say exactly what that bit does and why it's there.
Right.
And you have different types of way you can put notes, and you can put caveats and test tools and everything else. But if a well-documented workflow is easy for anybody to read.
Absolutely. The context here is also what stage are you in, because like if we've all studied software development, one of the most common things is red, green, refactor. Is, the first time you do it, solve it as messy as possible, because then you understand the problem you're solving. And then when you do the second round of refactoring, then you solve it the way you wish you had solved it the first time. But the thing is, we really only understand the problem truly once we've solved it once the messy way, and then you go refactor it and do it the pretty maintainable long-term way.
Me, I'm a mix of so many of you in so many ways. I use iterative most because in GIS I have a lot of while loops that I have to do. I have to iterate until I meet a certain threshold or a criteria. So I'm constantly doing that. I'll do a batch macro if it's a repetitive process that I need to wrap into the workflow itself. So if I've got like scraping a website and then I've got to do a bunch of same processes over and over again, but on criteria, I'll batch that. But, like John, I kind of have a library of those repeatable processes that I have to do over and over again. And then I just label that macro and I pull it to the canvas. I don't have to build 10 tools all of a sudden, but I'm not a huge macro user, mainly because it boils down to maintenance for me. One of the things is versioning, there we go, is an issue for me. And then also, debugging macros when they break, especially when you've got a macro inside a macro and you got to just open that up and figure out where is this one breakpoint happening. That's so frustrating when if I just had everything on the workflow canvas, I could just figure out exactly where the break is happening and I can fix that right there.
Yeah, so you added a third option to which Alex asked us in the WhatsApp channel, which is sometimes you use an app to pack a lot of functionalities within a workflow. I was thinking about the example you said, like, I have this workflow that generates 5 reports, but I want just 3. So probably my best approach to that would be offering some kind of user input to do that.
This one has a few more tools on it, but the interesting thing about this is the first thing I built wasn't actually the canvas. The first thing I built, if you go File, Open, and this is also very common the way we teach people, open workflow, browse. You see that there's a bunch of canvases here called test. Test generate options, test 10 to base 10 to base 5 migration. So we teach people to build the test cases before they build the actual canvas. So you build the test cases, and then you build the thing that actually does the work, and then you test if it works. So we teach people to do proper test-driven delivery. So if you're, for example, building an ETL, build something first that checks whether the ETL succeeded or failed. You know for a fact it's going to fail because you haven't built the ETL yet. Then you go build the ETL, and then progressively you're going to get more clean, successful test results.
How long do you give your analysts to make the logos?
So funny enough, all these logos are all just straight from Google. So it takes me 10 seconds. But
nice.
Until you have to maintain them. Which
yeah.
is,
Sorry, Sean, I interrupted you for the joke. Go ahead.
But part of the reason why is because we value maintainability and stability and you know, standing up in a long storm far more than an immediate result. So like the fact that a lot of our canvases are building an ETL to take it from a source system and transpose it and clean it up and do data quality checks and put it in an analytical database, that's a very common pattern for us. Whereas I don't think you folks are actually in the business of transporting data from one place through a database pipe and then putting it in another place and then doing proper Kimball data engineering on building dimensions and snowflakes. You guys don't do that for a living.
I see this approach very more complicated than building the self ETL and being called in sequence or isolating their execution. And I'm kind of trying to ask, where do you see that is easier in the maintainability of that kind of solutions? Because if something changes or fails in the ETL, debugging what is going on within the macro is going to be harder than a plain context in a workflow where that ETL happens. Sometimes you find out that if you copy and paste all that functionality that is within the macro in a new workflow, it runs, and when it's inside the macro, it doesn't run.
This decoder, if I want to know if it's working or not, all I do is I open up the test harness for test my decoder and run all my test cases, and then I know for a fact if the decoder is working or not because I got a tester for the decoder. We also put the test harness in production, so every day we run the regression tests. So we know that the latest version of what John built is not breaking because we're still running the same test cases as he was running last time.
Got it.
Is your main Alteryx user base still a business user, or is it mainly developers?
We have a spectrum, and on this end we have people who can just barely use Excel, and for them we teach them just to get it out of Excel and into Alteryx. And essentially our biggest celebration is when they stop using Excel. And then 6 months later, they start doing interesting shit. And now we try to get them off on a network share and into our database. And then they make that progression. And then I start teaching them developer practices. So we can continually moving people. But we also have people on this side who come to us with a master's in computer science. Okay. And for those people, I'm talking to them about, you know, how do you actually apply basic stuff like encapsulation. So Dave, absolutely, this is the right way that production canvases should look, and the only thing that would strike some chords with us is how much of this needs to be on one canvas versus how much of this could be wrapped into little chunks that would then be.
Why you use comment boxes and not containers for this? Because they are more difficult to move the whole unit.
I know.
And it always surprise me when I see these kind of things.
You know, and it's a stupid reason, and it's a reason that it's even difficult to explain it to you. When you put comment boxes into your workflow, it messes up your alignment, and I'm absolutely anal about aligning tools. You can't.
Yeah.
If you put a comment box in, you can't line things up.
You mean with the containers? You mean the containers?
Containers, yeah.
Okay, got it.
I will likely never adopt the Sean Adams model of I'm going to collapse everything down to a minimum number of things, right? I probably will continue to have very large things, but I would like to follow the AJ pattern of I want to see everything. I want to know what's going on, or I want to quickly be able to zoom in. And so sometimes I'll click on the container and hit Control 0, and it'll, you know, contextually zoom.
I-
Well,
I
now,
have to
the part,
edit.
now we're to the part where John's cursing. So yeah, we I don't know how much we'll have to edit this section out. Thank you, Mark.
Probably it would be a
Who's
good
the
idea
host?
to stop recording now.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, that was a really good,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of content that came out of that discussion